Greetings everyone. I made a video on how to replace the starter on a Lexus LS400 1995 and I did that because there were no real how-to videos online that showed how to do it. It's a difficult process. The starter sits underneath the intake plenum. But it also talks about taking the exhaust off to get to some EGR piping from behind and some coolant passages. But I found that wasn't necessary. I found a much easier way to do it. So I made this video here to kind of take you guys through the process in detail. And so I hope you find it useful. And let's go into the shop and take a look. I should mention before we go into the shop, and I realized this once I edited everything together, the very first video you're going to see is the plenum already removed. It's a very straightforward process. I didn't feel the need to walk you through that. Take some bolts off, disconnect some hoses and connectors, drain the coolant out, and just basically lift off the plenum to gain access to the starter. It's two-piece plenum, and then when you do go purchase a starter, they typically let you know that you would need new gaskets for the plenum. So I'm assuming you've got that already removed, and the next video will go straight to show you the starter location. So here's the location of the starter. You're looking at it in the center of the video here. It's disassembled. I've taken the armature off and so forth, and also the internals where the plunger are, the solenoid. But what I want to tell you is about how I gained access to get this thing out even. Ignore the damage to this side of the starter. I kind of broke some things, and it's the old one, so I don't have any interest in keeping it anyway. It's going to go back in the box as a core. So anyway, here is a coolant pipe that's kind of in the way right here, and the starter's held on with two bolts back in here. One bolt here and then one bolt over back in here. Very difficult to get to. There's virtually no access from behind here. Some of the instructions I heard, people were talking about taking the exhaust off from underneath to gain access to an EGR pipe right here that will allow you to take this off, this coolant passage, so that you can get actually a wrench on here. But I've found a simpler way. So what I've done is I needed to get this out of the way. So what I did is I pulled the armature off from the old one, okay? And what that allowed me to do is to pull this back and pop it out of the the water pump housing here. And then what I did is I can just get enough clearance. You can see that it's the armature's out of the way, to lift that up and then actually get that out of the way. So I put that over to the side like that, and now I've got access. You can see I already removed these bolts, but the bolts thread in here and they come in from the back side here. So let me grab a couple of bolts and then show you what I did to get them out. Okay, so here is one of the starter bolts. It threads in from behind, and it takes a 14mm wrench or socket. And so this thing was, installed from the back here. And on this side, I was able to get a wrench on it. I was able to get this wrench on it just to move it ever so slightly from this side to break it loose. On the other side, I was able to get this in from way from behind here, and also, like I said, just enough to get it to break loose. Then what I did is you can tell that a bit of the bolt was exposed through here. So I took a Dremel tool and cut a slit into it. I actually read online that one of the guys did that, so I thought, okay, that's worth a try. So once I had both bolts broken loose, and then all I did was use a screwdriver small enough to fit into this hole, and I screwed it in all the way. And then all I did back here is I held a magnet, and so when the bolt came out, the magnet caught it, and then I was able to pull it out. Now, I'm not going to reuse these bolts because I didn't have nuts that would thread onto this particular design. And the reason I say that is because my idea for reinstalling it, it would be difficult to try to get that bolt started in there and then screw it in backwards with a screwdriver and then snug it up the same way I had taken them out. So my idea rather was to take the new starter and drill the threaded portion, drill it out, and then take a couple of new bolts and actually run them in from the plenum side, and then so that I could just put a nut on the back, okay, like so, and then run them in. Yeah, I figured it would be a little bit easier. So I just came up with a couple of bolts long enough to make that work. And like I said, you know, it didn't really matter whether everything was aligned exactly to the millimeter, because this hole right here that fits into this area here, right here, is machined with very tight clearance, or tolerance rather. So when you get that put in here, it will be perfectly aligned with regards to the flywheel. So if these bolts here are a little bit off, it's not going to matter so much. So yeah, that'll be the next thing that I'm going to discuss, how to get the starter back in and snug everything back up. So I'm about to reinstall the new starter, and I wanted to put this piece in first for access for the coolant pipe. So I took the armature off. It's just held on by a couple of bolts, long bolts. When you do pull that apart, grab it here and carefully wiggle it out, because you don't want the armature actually to come out. It's got a couple of brushes here at the tail end, and it'd be incredibly difficult to reinstall. So just be very careful. You want that whole thing to come out intact like that, so that you can, you know, reinstall it pretty easily. And you're going to want to take this nut off right here. So here's how we do that. We take the nut on the back. We got the bolt at the bottom there. You can probably see it right there. Run it through, and then I hold that on with the magnet until I get it started, and then I snug it up. That's the exact same thing I did with this one over here. You can see the nut probably on the back side of it there. I've already snugged that up. Magnet is incredibly helpful. It took me 2 seconds to get that done, and then I'll snug it up. I'll get a wrench on the back there, and then I'll tighten it up from this side, and then what I'll do is I'll reinstall the armature here, and I'll tighten down that little connection here with a nut. Before I will do that armature reinstall, I've got to get my pipe back in here. Otherwise, once the armature is on, I won't be able to get that pipe in. So snug up the bolts, get the pipe back in, and then reinstall your armature. All right, there you have it. Everything's installed. Armature is back on. I've made the connection back here before I tighten that down. A 13 millimeter gear wrench will work with getting that snugged up down in here. And then reinstall your pipe, press it into the water pump housing, install your bolt, hook up all your connectors again. I took the opportunity and cleaned out with a vacuum this valley here. It gets pretty filthy with dirt and leaves. And then hook up your wires over here and your control wire. And then one word of advice, once you've got this all in this position here, go inside and turn your ignition key to make sure the starter actually works. And that's what I just did. It cranks nicely, and so now I'm at a point where all I've got to do is reassemble intake plenum with new gaskets and so forth. And then I'll have one more video with a couple of final tips, tricks, side notes, etc. I did want to mention that before you do any of this work, make sure you disconnect your negative cable here. Before you do anything, the first thing when you tackle this job is disconnect that. And then, anyway, once I have it all back together, I'll have a couple of final notes. Okay, got it all back together. Starts every time, just like it should. Pretty pleased with how it turned out. If I had to do this job again, I would take the shortcut, save a lot of time, get the job done just as well. I think total time expected to do it this way, knowing what I know now, is probably 3 hours, which is not bad considering all the stuff you have to take off. So yeah, hope this helps somebody, and leave some comments if you want. Thanks for watching.